I decided to buy this to fix a little niggle I had with the Aygo. Opening the bonnet is a pain, but worse than that is putting this rod in this tiny hole, so today we're going to fix that with these hood struts. Looking at what comes with the bonnet struts, you get everything you need for the install and it comes nicely packed. You've got 2 bonnet struts along with the brackets you need, and when I looked at this I did worry about the quality, but it does feel sturdy enough. Of course you have a bag of nuts and these terrible instructions that are frankly only really fit for the bin. I got started by inserting this pawn looking piece into this bracket, tightening it up with a size 12mm wrench, and you'll end up with something like this, which we need to put behind the existing brackets on the bonnet. Now, looking at these instructions, it doesn't really tell you which way the bracket should face, and it's only really in the latter pages that you see the joint facing inwards. It looks like I'm spraying these for the first time, but I sprayed these bolts like 50 times with WD-40. Years of not needing to be twisted had left these nuts like the impossible jam jar refusing to open, but after many, and I mean many attempts to free these nuts, it finally happened, and anyone who works on cars can tell you, once you feel that pressure just give way, it is amazing. It's then just a case of unscrewing the nut by hand, and there you go. One free nut. It's then just a case of doing the same with the other nut, and then you can slide the new bracket behind the existing one, and you'll see here that I've tightened the nuts back up enough just to hold it in place, but still loose enough to adjust the positioning, and I found it easier to slide the new bracket all the way to the top so that I could be absolutely certain that the brackets would line up on both sides. All that's left to do now is to repeat this process on the other side, and you'll have the bonnet properly prepped for these struts, and as I alluded to before, it's worth checking that these are attached properly and they look like they line up, which in our case they do. Now we can turn our attention to the front of the engine bay and delete this screw with a Phillips head screwdriver and replace it with a washer and another pawn-like looking screw. But as with most things, it's not always that simple, is it? As I began to twist the screw in by hand, it became abundantly clear that this hole was not big enough, so I decided to try and widen it with the screwdriver, and after a few attempts and some brute force with some pliers, I managed to get the thread to stick and the screw began to fall into place. Once I was sure it had threaded properly, I popped the screw out, popped the washer back in and screwed the offending pawn-like object back into place, and when done, you should have something that looks like this. Nice and sturdy. Job done. Now we can move on to assembling the struts, and we can start by screwing this plastic head down onto the metal rod, and then once that's done, that plastic head actually attaches to the frontmost part of the bonnet, and just to reiterate that, this is the direction you want your bonnet strut to be facing. It's then a case of attaching the top end of the bonnet strut to the bonnet itself, but this is where it gets a bit fiddly, and that's because we need to stop this bonnet strut from popping off. And to do that, the bonnet strut uses this little locking mechanism that needs to be clipped into place to stop the bonnet struts popping off, which I think is rather clever until you end up losing one, but we won't talk about that just yet. You'll notice that I decided to take a moment to test the attached strut before I attach the other one, and it's worth noting that some people do just install one rather than both because it will lift the bonnet, but it is a bit limp. I also thought by closing the bonnet it allowed me to check if the strut was actually catching or not, which it wasn't, so that's great. I then got to work installing the other pawn-like screw to attach the bonnet strut to it, which went fine, but when I went to attach it at the top using the provided locking clip, that's when disaster struck. I bloody lost it. I thought, that's it, I'm screwed, and there's no way I'm going to find it in this. But then I had an idea. I was thinking that if I could just make a makeshift clip, that would be ideal because it's only really a thin piece of metal. That's when I decided a little humble paper clip would probably do the trick. I popped it in this small hole just to create a bit of friction so when I forced the joint in, it would have a hard time coming back out. Once I'd done that, I then wrapped the remaining paper clip around the strut to make it nice and neat and just gave it a little wiggle to make sure it was as secure as it could be. And then that was it. Job done. And I have to say, the results are really worth it. What I like best is that I can now open the bonnet with one finger and you don't need to mess about putting a rod into the tiniest of holes. A really good result, but it does warrant some extra thinking though, as some people have a few worries about doing it to a car that doesn't naturally come with the space for bonnet struts. So the question is, why wouldn't you do something like this? Well, my first thought was that it might add unnecessary vibrations and overall noise to the car, but having tested vibrations with the vibrometer app on my phone that I popped in its usual holster, the differences are negligible really. You can see that at 30 miles an hour before the installation and after, the story isn't that much of a different one. It was much the same tale when comparing it at 50 miles an hour too, so I'm not massively concerned that adding these bonnet struts are making the car noisier in any way, but perhaps I should be a little bit worried about this next thing. So some people who have installed bonnet struts, especially the no drill variety like the ones that I've used, they mention concerns about load as it will be reversed and may put strain on the original bonnet brackets, potentially either causing them to snap or just break or fail. But in my view, we aren't really pushing the bonnet past its original load position, so there shouldn't be too much extra pressure on the original hinges anyway. And of course, it's something I'll keep an eye out for, but I'm not overly concerned. And another thing that pops up is bonnet alignment issues, but as you've seen, because I've pushed the bracket as far to the top as it can go on each side, alignment isn't an issue, and because we don't need to drill, these bonnet struts are not permanent, so you can actually remove them and go back to stock if, for example, you end up selling the car or just decide that you don't like them and want to take them out. The biggest fear people seem to have is the bonnet struts melting, as they may be resting on engine parts that get hot, but in my search for this, it doesn't seem common, and obviously you do have to worry about general wear and tear, but again, I'm not usually concerned about this, as instances of them melting or failing are few and far between, and these worries shouldn't take away from how useful the install actually is. And if you fancy picking up a kit of your own, I'll leave one in the description below.